Hello and welcome to this week's IG Live. Today we are going to be talking to longtime MKB member and author Wakanyi Hoffman. She is going to be joining us to talk about her brand new picture book, which is Sala, Mountain Warrior, and it's set among the Samburu people of Kenya. So we're going to be talking all about representation of Indigenous people, how we can share this timeless wisdom with our children, and storytelling is such a great way to do that. Picture books are just the kind of the latest incarnation of how we can pass on stories to our children. So we're going to talk about how she did her children's book and why, and also how we can talk about Indigenous cultures not as something exotic and stuck in time, but as cultures that evolve and change and that have a lot to teach the rest of us about how we can function in today's modern world. So she should be joining us here shortly. Again, we are going to be talking to author Wakanyi Hoffman and about her latest book, Sala, Mountain Warrior. It is now available in Europe. It's available for pre-order here in the US, which is where I'm joining us. I'm joining Amazon, and either go ahead and order it or pre-order it. I believe it will be available in the US in January. Hang on just a second. I'm getting her on here for you. Oh, there we go. Hi.
Hi. Hi,
Good
Leanne.
to see you again.
Nice to see you again. Thank you for having me.
Yes, and for those that don't know, Wakanyi and I just talked over on Makeaway Media just a few days ago, really, last week. And I encourage you to go watch that interview because we are going to do our best not to repeat ourselves. Although, of course, there will be some overlap, obviously, because we're talking about her brand new picture book. But we'll try to cover some new ground. So if you haven't seen that one, I encourage you to go watch it. And there's just so much that we could talk about that's why we're doing it in 2 different sessions. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really glad.
Well, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself for those that don't know you and tell us about your new picture book.
Sure. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone who's joined us today. I'm really glad to be here. My name is Wakanyi Hoffman. I'm a children's book author. I am also a storyteller from Africa, and I do research around Indigenous knowledge from Africa and also in relation to Indigenous knowledge from around the world. And Sala, Mountain Warrior is my debut children's book, published by OtterBarry Press. I have done other children's books self-published, so this is really the first one that is sort of published mainstream.
Yes, which I know we did the 12 days of, I'm sorry, I can't remember the name off the top. It's the 12 days of African Safari, is that?
Safari, that's right, you got it right.
Yes, so we talked about that. That was, maybe was it a year ago or 2 years ago? It was a while ago.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, we had an interview about that and that is a beautiful book as well. I mean, I don't want anybody to think that self-published books are not wonderful, but it is exciting that now you're doing something new and having it published through a more traditional publisher.
That's right. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, why don't you tell us, first of all, so this book is based on the Samburu people. What inspired you to write a book about them? And can you tell us a little bit more about them for those that don't know?
Sure. So the Samburu people are one of the last indigenous communities remaining around the world, and remaining, by that I mean intact in their original land. The Samburu people have been in Kenya they live in northern part of Kenya, very arid and semi-arid region of the country, landscape-wise. And they've been there for, well, I think 1500 is around the time that they arrived. They migrated from Sudan. So they have a Sudanese relationship there. And so they've been around for about 500 years. And they're quite an interesting group of people in the sense that they have retained their cultural way of being, and they are semi-nomadic, so they tend to move around quite a bit, but usually around the same region. Mm-hmm. And the way in which they organize themselves is very exclusive, right? So they live in an excluded part of the country, and therefore it means that they have had quite a lot of generations of doing the same thing over and over again, to which extent that they have sort of formalized their way of being. So Sala, the writing of this book, is very much an attempt to change some of the narratives that some their way.
Oh, sorry, we lost your audio there for a second. You said this, that Sala was about changing the narrative.
That's right. So Sala, the book itself is based around a Samburu girl. Her name is Sala. And she is attempting to change this narrative of what a Samburu girl can or is allowed to become, right? So it's a very restricted society when it comes to girls. And usually girls are really protected in the community, but that protection then tends to mean that they are treated as if they are some kind of property to some extent. So Sala, this is her attempt of breaking out of that narrative and really owning her own story as her own authentic little girl. What would that look like? What would she want for herself if decisions weren't being made for her? And I think that is any girl can relate to that around the world, but in particular, an indigenous group like the Samburu people.
Yeah, it is a really empowering story for any kid to read. And we had kind of talked about that in our previous interview about kids having courage to kind of break out of what their parents or their community's expectations are. But like you said, it has particular importance when you talk about Indigenous communities, especially because I think the stereotype is that Indigenous communities are portrayed as kind of timeless, that they never change. They're kind of stuck in the past in a way. So how does your book changing that perception? And then kind of beyond that, how can cultures change without kind of losing the essence of who they are?
So we talk about Indigenous communities in relation to ancient wisdom. We talk about them as if they're stuck or dated in a particular time and place. We talk about ancient Egyptians, ancient Greece. We go as far back, but we never remember that they're still around. They're still maintaining their way of living. If you talk about, the San community in the Kalahari Desert, these are some of the oldest, they are actually the oldest known human ancestors that we have. 20,000 years they've been around, right? And they've maintained their way of living. But that doesn't mean that they are still living in a cave. They're hunter-gatherers. They're still doing that. But they've learned new ways of hunting and gathering. They've learned new ways of tracking. And we've got, communities like the Taos Pueblo in New Mexico, right? Have been around, have lived in the same place for 1,200 years. But that doesn't mean that they're doing the same thing. They're adapting to environment as it changes. They're adapting their way of life, but still maintaining the values. So when I talk about that, what I'm talking about is values. The values are timeless. The value of reciprocity, of interconnectedness, this idea of the individual is in relation to the community that they live in. The community is in relation to how they relate to the environment around them. So this balance, this individual, community, and the environmental balance is a real intricate part of being Indigenous in Indigenous communities. And that's really something that grows over time. So how we look at an individual today in an Indigenous community is very different to how maybe they might have looked at themselves 700 years ago. Mm-hmm. But that the quality of that relationship, interpersonal relationship between an individual and the community, and what that individual means when it comes to what your gift to the world is timeless. Mm-hmm. So that's what I really mean. And that's what I hope that people can understand when we're talking about Indigenous communities. They're not dated. It's not ancient wisdom. It's really timeless values that we're carrying forward. Yeah.
Right. I like that shift in perspective about the timeless versus ancient. And I know it's hard to not fall into that trap. I do it myself, talking about this ancient wisdom. But like you said, it's really, it is ancient in a sense, but in a sense, it's also very modern and, like you say, timeless. And speaking of a specific example in your book, I know you talked about the beadwork. Mm-hmm. That's kind of a pivotal part of the story, but it's something really important to the Samburu culture, but she's kind of changing the meaning of it. Can you tell us about that? What does it mean traditionally, and then how are you kind of changing the meaning of it in the book?
That's right. So in Samburu culture, there is a tradition of gifting children. So when a Samburu child is born, the girl receives a brown bead, and that's a fertility to show that she will become a mother and she'll become prosperous in that way as maternally. And a boy receives a green bead, which is that they're going to have a lot of land around them. And so at some point when a Samburu girl is of age, and of age is quite young in modern sense. You know, we're talking a 10 to 13-year-olds. There is a ceremony in which they put a beaded band around their waist. And this is to signify that you are of age or marriageable age. Now, that's a very young child. You know, we're talking about a 10, 13, 14-year-old child. And so I wanted to flip that narrative a little bit, because that's actually a part of the Samburu culture that is being challenged over time. And that it's a difficult story to talk about, because it is very much tied to their wanting to show peer group, right? So you were born at this age and this is how old you are. But at the same time, there is a dark side to that now you're old enough to get married, you know, and obviously we know that's not a marriageable age by any means. So what I wanted to show was that you could take the same idea of bidding and then turn that around, and it becomes a story of conquering your own story, of telling your own story. And so in the book, actually, Sala has a very special relationship with the grandmother, which is also a very beautiful thing to see, to watch in the Samburu tribe. You have the grandmother becomes the grandmother is usually the wisdom keeper and also the teacher. And so I wanted that to be the story of Sala, is that she then tells her own story and receives a very special bead for having climbed the mountain, and then that becomes her bead of empowerment rather than of oppression.
I love that, because that's such a great example, like you said, of retaining things that are important to the culture, but also adapting them to today, and maybe to helping them those values evolve. And I want to talk a little bit more about the grandmother, because you mentioned that, and that is such an important value about elders and passing on this knowledge. Can you talk a little bit more about that, and also just the general idea of storytelling and how that's such an important way to pass on these kind of timeless values?
So grandmothers are an integral part of the community. They're literally the pillar that holds, the glue that holds the family, the community together in all, this is true for all indigenous communities. And so the grandmother figure in a Samburu community is really that old lady that passes down knowledge and the wisdom. And in fact, traditionally, even within the oldest human beings that we know, the Kalahari, the San people in the Kalahari, women were actually the trackers, the wildlife trackers. So there is a very special relationship between the community and the elderly, and in particular, women. And I really wanted to show this tradition of wisdom keeping and how grandmothers can teach us a lot about what we may have forgotten. And that's the way in which we pass down this information to children, and then they grow up and pass down that knowledge. And this is done very orally in African traditions. So this is a method of learning, really, of teaching children about indigenous wisdom and knowledge that we could not possibly document or find in a classroom. So I wanted that to be a very big part of this storytelling. And so grandmother is a very big part of this book throughout the story.
And that was something that if I remember right, that you experienced as a child also with your own grandmothers, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. So I grew up in Kenya, and I grew up on the edge of a forest, of an indigenous forest. But also during the school holidays, we would often go back to where our grandmothers were. And I learned a lot just being in close proximity to this old, you know, they would be right over there doing what grandmothers did, which was tend to the farm and tend to the animals and all of that. But in a way, they were often looking out for the children and ensuring that in one way or another, they're passing down information or knowledge to us. So we learned by observation. We learned by listening to them. We learned through the songs that they taught us. We learned also sometimes just by having a storytelling session, very informally, very naturally, very organically. But this was a very big part of my upbringing as well.
And I think that's beautiful, because you're not a grandmother yet, but you're, you know, in some ways taking on that role. It's interesting because, like you said, it's usually done orally and it's done very informally, and yet you're also helping kind of take these stories to a wider audience. Has it been hard to kind of translate that kind of oral storytelling tradition into a picture book, or is it just kind of like a new medium for how to pass this on?
Yeah, it's challenging. Well, now we have podcasts, and of course, that's what a podcast really is. It's oral storytelling. But how do you, how do you translate that into a children's book? I tried to use the voice of the grandmother as much as I could. Have the grandmother tell the story. So the grandmother actually tells a lot of stories within the story in throughout the book. She talks about the grandfather. She references a lot of other stories of the family that she keeps. All the beads around her neck are actually different stories of different people who have conquered different things within the family. So yes, in a way, it's difficult to capture the oral storytelling aspect and in written form, but you can do it by assigning the storyteller the role of storytelling. And who better than grandmother? So I feel like I did justice in that way, right? I managed to capture the grandmother's voice in the book, and therefore then I brought that oral storytelling aspect into the story.
Yes, I love that. And this is such a celebration of Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous culture at a time when often they're very marginalized. What do you think in general, because I know this is a passion of yours, what does Indigenous knowledge have to offer us today in the modern world? Like, we've talked about this before, how it really can teach us. We think of it as being something in the past, which of course we've already said it isn't, but still sometimes people have trouble connecting it to modern problems like AI or the environment or modern conflicts.
Well, I'll give you a very, very clear, concrete example of what Indigenous knowledge is. So within the scientific community, there's a well understood idea that the origins of science are actually Indigenous knowledge. So where did human beings learn to become? Where did our scientific mind come from? How did we become scientists? If you look at the San people in the Kalahari Desert, those are one of our first scientists. They are actually our first scientists through the tracking method, tracking wildlife. And how do they do that? There's an intuitive way in which they learn how to do animal tracking. And that's science. That's the foundation of science, observation, learning through observation. So there's a lot Indigenous knowledge, Indigenous people can teach us. And there's a lot of undocumented Indigenous knowledge. A lot of it we have managed to capture and turn into scientific exploration. But truly, we don't know what we don't know, right? So there is a lot of knowledge out there. And I think that Indigenous people have a quality to them, which is that they are very much invested in protecting the land and learning how best to continue flourishing. So what is that wisdom? Where does that wisdom come from? It comes from experience. And it also comes from the experience of being human, of interacting with each other on a very human to human level. They care, they have a quality of care about them, which then translates into care for not just the individual, but the community. And then that then translates into the care for the environment. So I think Indigenous people could actually bring that wisdom of the general idea that human beings have a quality of care about us, that we are empathetic, that we save each other's lives because we care about each other. That is some wisdom that is perhaps not yet codable. We haven't been able to code that and infuse it into our AI big data models. And so what would that look like if you're looking for an answer online and then you've got an Indigenous person's voice at the back of that as a wisdom that becomes the source of the answer, or even the source of the question? We need to teach our children how to ask the right questions. And what would that look like? I think that has a lot to do with wisdom.
I love that, because I think modern science has been very good at extracting data from Indigenous knowledge, like especially about medicines, pharmaceuticals. There's a lot of our modern medicine have first came from Indigenous knowledge, but not so much about adopting the values, which is what you're talking about, the wisdom of how to use that data, how to use those pharmaceuticals, how to live with each other. And that's something we really all have to learn a lot from. Through picture books like yours are such a great way to teach our kids to have that kind of respect. And so to wrap up, where can people get your book, Sala Mountain Warrior, and are you planning on writing more?
Thank you for asking that. Yes, I am planning. I hope that with a little nudging, I will be able to write a second sequel to Sala, and we'll see what Sala becomes, because she's still very young and grandmother is quite old. So we'll see how the dynamics of that change. The book is available online. It's available on Amazon, I believe, globally, and it will be available in Amazon US sometime in January 2024. But it is also available in the publisher's bookstore, OtterBarry Press, and you can order that, and that can be shipped anywhere in the world.
And I actually checked here in the US. It's listed on Amazon, so you can go ahead and pre-order it. You won't get your copy until January, but you can go ahead and pre-order it.
Oh, that's amazing! Thanks for letting me know about that. Ooh.
Well, thank you so much for joining us. And of course, you can visit her profile if you want the direct links to it on Amazon, or just go search it up. It's Sala, S-A-L-A, Mountain Warrior. Thank you for taking the time to talk with us. And anybody who's joining us late, this will be up in a few minutes on Instagram and later on our YouTube channel. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you so much, Liana. Have a nice day.
Bye. You too.
Bye.